So, hello everyone. I have, wow, this is kind of sensitive. I have got apparently 26 minutes to be polite for the next speaker. I am talking with you about something like the combined experience of 18 years of open source evangelism. I've been in open source only since 2005. I know this event is older and it's super cool to be here, and it's a huge privilege to be here. So the only solution is for me to talk fast and skip through stuff. I'm going to be here the rest of the day and at the event tonight, so if anybody has any questions, I would love to talk with you about this stuff. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be here tomorrow because it's my privilege to be speaking in Poland on Saturday about the same stuff. So yes, thank you. So I'm going to talk fast. If you have questions, super happy. Probably afterwards would be better. I think we're so busy doing cool stuff and being successful that we're forgetting to tell the world the important stories that it needs to hear to remember what's special about us and to remember that we are a viable or a better option in many, 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 many cases. So this is my company, Open Strategy Partners. We're specialized in content and communications for technology organizations, technical product companies, technical agencies, and open source projects, and we have super deep roots in open source, and I will be talking about that this afternoon. Me, super quick, open source since 2005, 18th employee at Acquia, where I went from engineering to community to marketing, and that's where I learned to do technology marketing, both right and wrong, but I was an open source evangelist there for a long time, which was a fantastic privilege. My business partner has an MBA, international management experience, and she's a genius, so as everyone could tell, I'm the pretty one, she's the brains behind the operation. I got very, very upset. I got so upset about something on January 31st this year that I didn't, and to this day, I haven't tweeted about it, but this article came out. And there is a wonderful, wonderful project in Australia called GovCMS. And GovCMS powers the websites, hundreds of websites for something like 150 government departments in the Australian federal government, plus websites for a number of Australian states. It's built on the Drupal open source CMS. It provides employment for Australians. It keeps Australian tax dollars in Australia. They've got an entire servers package built around it. It's fantastic, and it works incredibly well. And somebody in the Department of, Department of Digital Transformation or something in Australia. So what happened is Deloitte Consulting and Adobe salespeople got the right meeting with somebody in the Australian government, and the Australian government decided that they needed a DXP, and that since GovCMS couldn't do that, not understanding what open source is about, not understanding about integrations, not understanding about APIs, without writing a tender, they have spent, the Australian government, that piece of it has entered into contracts worth more than 80 million Australian dollars for an Adobe system to do personalization that's incompatible with the GovCMS that is powering the entire government infrastructure. And it's horrible, terrible news. And I've seen this in other very large organizations. Somebody got the right meeting at the right time with the right person and got in where open source is clearly a better choice, not just because we're in open source, but because it saves money, it keeps tax money in the region where it's collected, and so on. So Australia has already spent about 36 million of that money. Now, here's the fun part. There is no provision under Australian law currently that allows them to collect, store, and process Australian citizens' data to give them a personalized experience. So the government has spent 36 million Australian dollars for features that they are not allowed to use, can't use, and don't use, and I'm really angry about this, and so since the 31st of January, I've been putting together this presentation in my mind. We need to tell people what is open source, why it's better, when it's better, how it's better, what we do, I think, you see, that we won, right? Anyone who's been in open source since the 2000s, when the economies crashed in 2008, and all of the, budget consciousness became the word of the day. How many of you make a living with open source software? Right? And if anyone doesn't, how many of you use open source software every day? Everyone needs to put their hands up because it's everywhere, right? So we've been in this so long. I know Typo 3 agencies in Germany that for the last 10 years have been running at 120 to 160% capacity every year, right? They don't need to think, they don't need to evangelize, they don't need to tell people, because and we're paying our rent, we're doing great. We won, right? We won, we're doing great. I think we forgot to tell people about it, and we need to evangelize again, because stuff like what happened in Australia keeps happening. I've been talking with a friend and colleague of mine named Matthias Bolt-Lesniak about all of this. He's also in the open source evangelism game. He runs a podcast called Open Source Utopia, which is really interesting. It's 2.5-minute episodes talking about open source in a context that I've been doing this for a very long time. It's in a context that I've never thought about sometimes. It's really extraordinary and very interesting, so it's definitely worth listening to. But based on being upset and my ongoing conversations with him, I want to talk about, and really quickly, right, some of the things that make us special, starting with the value proposition of free and open source software. I want to talk briefly about how free and open source software, FOSS, helps us as open source business people. A little bit about how we can and are making the world a better place, things that we're doing in civil society, some really small but inspiring stories, questions about what we might do next to make this situation better going forward for us and our project and our friends and our colleagues. And if we have time, maybe 1 or 2 fun videos. So, very, very quickly, these are the topics that I want to talk about, because I didn't change slides on time, so I told you all that stuff. So, very quickly, who's familiar with the 4 freedoms that are the basis of open source, right? Yes? No? Okay. So, the 4 freedoms, I'm going to get to that in a moment. You see, this is how Microsoft talked about open source software in 2001. I now have very good friends who work for Microsoft in their open source practice and use pure open source machines and open source software every day. There's been an extraordinary change, but back in 2001, this charming gentleman said this sort of thing. Nowadays, of course, it looks very, very different. At some point, I know the Linux Foundation has its own problems nowadays, but at some point, Jim Zemlin said this about Microsoft and their feelings about open source software. So, these 4 freedoms. We are allowed to use open source software. Anyone is. Put it out there in any of the open source licenses, the Libre licenses. You can use it always. Nobody can take it away from you. You're allowed to see all the code. That means you can decide whether it's secure or not. You can have someone else look it for you. You can understand what you're getting and what it does, what it doesn't do. You can make any changes so that it does exactly what you need, how you need it. And if you, whatever it is that you do, nobody can tell you that you can't if you're dealing with open source software. That's already incredible. And then what really makes this an amazingly virtuous circle is that once you've made those changes, you can give it to anyone else. If it's in GPL, you can give it to anyone else, as long as it's still available under a GPL license, except for the web services loophole, another talk. MIT licenses even let you share the code or build it into a commercial product. It's a really, really, really cool, empowering set of ideas, right? And as a consequence, there are the famous, we get to share our best ideas, right? And what happens is, we're putting our best ideas in there, somebody else sees it, they take it, they do something, we become friends, you get your idea back better with things that you never would have thought of, right? And these communities of practice, events like this, develop, and it's amazing, right? One of the old open source chestnuts is talking about free, right? So free as in beer, you can just have it. And free as in speech, you can use it for anything you want to. Matthias Bolt-Lesniak, the guy I was just talking about, he also talks about freedom of choice. People can use our software to do things that we don't approve of. People can use our software and not give back and not contribute and not be part of our communities. But that's also okay. And in 15 minutes, thank you. And I'm on like my third slide. This is going to be a disaster. Okay, so you have the choice to do with it what you want, and that's kind of extraordinary. What I like to tell people and help set expectations when we're selling these things is it's not free. It has a license cost of 0, but it's free like a puppy, right? You can't just download the puppy and then ignore it. You have to pet it, and you have to take it outside, and you have to feed it, and you have to grow and help it, and so that it becomes the beautiful creature that it can be. Our open source projects are the same. Our software is the same. Our communities are the same. We're not just getting free stuff. We are responsible for our friends and peers and colleagues and the projects that we put into the world. Right, very brief excerpt from Matthias's podcast. If we can't hear this, I'm just going to skip it. The fundamental concept here is that software takes on a life of its own, and when you share your ideas and they come back better, it's also way more than you could have known before. Let's see, does this play?
Open Source Utopia podcast. Well, few have ever become rich from making open source software. Developers are essentially giving away their product for free without expecting anything in return. It's also a really poor platform for vanity. Developing open source software is a lot of work, and I think most projects actually start out with someone scratching their own itch and building something for themselves. However, open sourcing a project is like casting a magic spell. Dead things come alive. Woohoo! No, it's not zombie software or Frankenstein's monster. It's more like a fairy tale. Think about Pinocchio or the gingerbread boy, for example. Well, the story goes like this. There are some parents that wish they had a child. Magically, their ersatz, a wooden puppet or cookie boy, becomes alive. The child doesn't only have a life, but also a mind of its own. Well, the same thing happens with a successful open source project. It gets a life of its own. Suddenly, there are other people around with thoughts about how the software should be. That might be hard to get accustomed to, but unlike the fairy tale, software doesn't run away. That's because everyone is sharing a common goal, making the piece of software better. That is a job best done together. Enter the open source community, where the roles of buyer and seller no longer apply. What kind of a marketplace is that? Well, hang in there for the next chapter and ultimate freedom.
So, ladies and gentlemen, Matthias Bolt-Lesniak, a very good friend of mine, one of the strangest and most interesting people I know, and I love his take on this stuff. His Twitter handle is coming up later. He's also a member of the Typo 3 Association board, and works for my company sometimes, full disclosure. So, let's get on with talking about business and open source. Open source has radically changed the economics of infrastructure and cost structures, return on investment, and the potential value of the information that we deal with as professionals. You've probably heard all this before, but it goes beyond just paying our own rent, even though I have to say, even if we're all idealists in this room, it's really, really hard to remain an idealist if you're not, if you don't have a roof over your head. So, being able to be employed is important, right? So here we have the 4 freedoms. I used to do sales pitches, essentially. So going from explaining the 4 freedoms more or less like I just did, to saying, look, this isn't free. It doesn't mean that you can just take out the per seat license cost from your project planning. Really, if your project is worth something to you, yes, it can be cheaper, but a much better idea is to spend the same amount of money and stay in the microphone zone, spend the same amount of money, but get a better project out of it, right? If you take the money that you would have spent on the license and reallocate it, you get a better design, you get a better user experience, you get better implementation, you do more testing, you hire more people, you do training, whatever it is. Spend the same money, you get more out of it. So we tell people, when you spend money on open source software, you're always getting functionality for your money. You're not paying for permission to see if it would work for you and what it might be able to do. So testing an open source project, your maximum cost is setting up a team, downloading it and trying it for a few days, right? So paying your people. It's incredible for business. I would take people through the difference between a proprietary-based project and an open source-based project, and you can see it's also important not to tell people that all this stuff is free, because internet and IT projects are incredibly complex and expensive, right? And everybody's got equipment costs, hosting costs, bandwidth, and so on and so on and so on, right? But when you get down to reallocating the license fee, the fact that you can switch vendors anytime you want, depending on where you are, you own your data, you can take it with you. You can make it what you want when you need it and not rely on Microsoft wanting your weird special feature for your weird special business. In open source, be weird and special, that's awesome, right? And do it when you want, when you need. It's incredible. So these have been very powerful sales arguments for us, and this last part is really important for us to be telling people in the world again. The UK government IT supplier map used to look like this. Let's say, I don't remember the exact date, I have to look it up again, but let's say 15 years ago. And if you can't tell, right, those 4 or 5 dots there are London, Reading, Brighton, and wherever the other one is. They map on exactly, who can guess? Microsoft, HP, IBM, Salesforce, Oracle, right? All of those headquarters. Government bought all of its IT in the southeast. The vast majority of those are not UK companies. UK tax dollars went wherever the hell, but didn't stay in the local economy. As part of its magnificent digital transformation plan, which has been spectacular in the UK, they did some test projects where they said, we're going to change how you can bid on government IT contracts. And for contracts under £100 million, we are going to allow small and medium businesses to bid on them, and we're going to have a preference for open source if and when it is as good or better than a proprietary offering. And making those changes, allowing small businesses to bid on projects under £100,000, and a preference for open source, took the map that you remember from a moment ago and made it into that. Now, that is UK tax money being spent in the economy. That is thousands of jobs, that is thousands of people's lives better off in their own economy. And that can happen whether your context is Europe, whether your context is Croatia, whatever it is. This is unbelievably powerful, right? And oddly, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of those dots are even in Ireland, which is in Europe. Awesome for Ireland. But this is unbelievably empowering. And it's unbelievably important that we don't send all of our money and all of our data to the United States, for example. Okay? So, another quick story. How many minutes do I have? 7. Oh my God. Okay, so look, think about governments, right? What do governments need to do? In a democracy, in a civil society, a government cares about its people. It cares that you are healthy, that you are educated, and that you are productive in some form, right? So governments need to spend money to build infrastructure. One of the things they do is that they can decide that we're going to put a bridge between this side of this river and that side of this river because we think that commerce will happen, or that there'll be more Tinder dates or whatever it is, right? But we're going to build a bridge. It's going to cost whatever it costs, and then we're going to see what happens. Fine, infrastructure needs to happen. This is one way that you can spend government money. You spend it, it's there. You see what happens. Governments also can practice within their own countries, or in terms of international aid, they can decide that it's important that people are vaccinated. They want us to be healthy, right? So governments can spend money on health programs, on vaccinations, so that we're healthier, we live longer, we're more productive, our allies do better, and so on. We can also choose, I don't approve of this, but governments also choose to spend money on bombs when they think that someone else is bad for us, and right? But this is what governments do, right? When you spend government money on open source infrastructure, you can build one department staff management portal and copy it and use it in every department. You can build 1 or 2 or 3 website models and use it in Australia, hundreds and hundreds of departments. And every time you use it, you're not spending that money again. And that investment gets more valuable, and there's more good in the world. This is incredibly powerful. Next story. My dad says, and this applies to governments, right? If you have a restaurant, you gotta own the bricks. If you're doing well, your landlord is gonna come back. If you're renting your space, oh, I love your food, I love your tapas, it's awesome, this is the perfect location for you. By the way, I'm doubling your rent. Just like Oracle can say, hey, that software that you built your business on, we're turning it off next January. You can buy this other alternative, but it doesn't do the same thing and it's twice as expensive. I want my government to own the infrastructure that we operate on, just like I want ideally my business to be based on that. This is an open story, and it's incredibly important for us to be telling this. Open source is generally more secure because people are looking at it, and when it's used in governments, then it's being tested and probed constantly. And this is the US Department of Defense that's saying it, and saying it a long time ago. Awesome. Hey, so we're also doing we're doing good in the world. There's so much to say here. The Typo 3 community. The Rwandan government said, hey, Typo 3, they literally reached out. It's like, we've got these websites, we don't know what version they are, we don't know how to upgrade them, we don't know what's going on. Could you put us in touch with someone to help us? The Typo 3 community, the Typo 3 association, sent people to Rwanda to look at the infrastructure, and they didn't just hey, sure, that'll be 50 grand and we'll come and fix it for you and you can sign a fat contract with us. They sent community members down to train local people, government IT staff and local agencies, to upgrade, maintain, and now build new websites in Rwanda based on Typo 3. There are currently 250 plus of them that are being done. It's an ongoing project we're developing. I'm part of it, a sort of a 4 pillars of digital government standard to take to other countries to help them out. It's incredible. It's open source. It's fantastic. So we can do international aid with open source software. This is a superpower. This gives people jobs, it gives people perspective, it gives people to move to other countries, right? Training them with enterprise level IT. It's amazing. It's honestly amazing. GovCMS in Australia, hundreds of websites that I said, local agencies, local people getting trained, all the same story on a huge scale. Okay, so there's a lot more. There's super much more. We need to think about things like, why does Nestle get to pull water out of the ground and sell it to us? We need to think about things like, why is Monsanto allowed to patent and copyright seeds that we make bread out of? There is a website called opensourceseeds.org. It's super cool. Someone in my town in Cologne in Germany is selling open source bread, which is super fun. We need to think about the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people that are working on open source. We somehow need to get together and start pushing back. Apple spends so much on marketing. IBM spends so much on marketing. There are probably more of us doing more but we're not visible. And we gotta figure out how to be visible and tell these stories to people so that Deloitte and Adobe don't show up and tell us that we should rip out our entire government infrastructure because they could do it better. Thank you.